Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending this afternoon's Central Bank Listens webinar. My name is Ray Farley, and I'm the Head of Communications here in the Central Bank, and I'm the moderator for today's event. Today, we've been holding two sessions. This morning's event concentrated on gathering the perspectives of business representatives in the real economy, and this afternoon, we're engaging with you as representatives of civil society. Governor McClough will speak to you in a few moments and he'll provide you with more context for today's event, and you'll all have received the information about the event in advance. As you'll have seen from the agenda, today our objective is to hear from you about your perspectives on the ECB Strategy Review. Now, much of the time will be devoted to discussion and there'll be plenty of opportunity for people to contribute to the discussion. We would encourage as many of you as possible to take part. If you would like to contribute and take part in the discussion, please use either the chat function or the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen. We will then send you a message before it's your turn to speak, advising you that we'll be bringing you into the webinar. And then when I call on you, please unmute yourself and turn on your camera. And we'll work to make sure as many of you as possible have the opportunity to contribute during the session. Then in terms of follow-up from this meeting, we'll be providing a report to the European Central Bank detailing the perspectives of Irish citizens in relation to its strategy review. And we'll also provide you with a copy of that report. And we'll also be publishing a recording of this webinar on our website in due course, and we will let you know when that is completed. So to open proceedings and to welcome you all to today's event and to introduce the ECB's strategy review, I'd like to introduce Gabriel McClough, Governor of the Central Bank. Governor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Ray. Thank you all for coming to this event. An opportunity for you to inform the European Central Bank's strategy review. It's, as Ray said, it's one of two events that we're hosting today. As Governor of the Central Bank and a member of the ECB's Governing Council, I'd like to welcome you formally to it. The Governing Council is the place which assesses economic and monetary developments in the euro area and makes monetary policy decisions, amongst other things. And over the last year or so, we've been looking at structural shifts in the euro area since our last review in 2003. The global economy looked very different then. Inflation was higher. Central banks were more concerned about keeping it under control. And we decided back then that an inflation aim of below but close to 2% was the appropriate thing to focus on. But 18 years is a long time, and it's now time to look at our strategy once more. So taking a step back and from the day-to-day conduct of policy to reflect on the bigger picture does allow us to ensure that our approach is fit for purpose. And it helps us to consider the assumptions that underlie our decision-making. So, for example, how has demography or technology or greater global interconnectedness affected how the economy works? What's the role of structural reform and fiscal policy to support monetary policy objectives? And how do macroprudential policies and monetary policy interact? And how do the significant technological shifts of recent years, combined with the shifts that we've seen over the last 12 months, affect our understanding of the economy? And some of these issues are outside our control, but we do need to consider them when making decisions. In contrast, there are other questions which aren't within our power to control and are very much the subject of the current review, which is, what do we mean by price stability? Is our measure of inflation the right one? And are we communicating well enough? So our review will consider and is considering the current economic environment, but we want to ensure that any new strategy is robust to changes over time. And the pandemic has, of course, brought new topics into greater focus, most notably the interaction between fiscal and monetary policy. While addressing all of these issues will be important for society, we'll need to be mindful of the extent of our own mandate at the European Central Bank and the tools we have at our disposal. And it is worth saying that we're separating out the review from our current decision making on monetary policy. I mean, we'll continue to do that as we would in the normal way. So let me just say a little bit about the Central Bank of Ireland's role within the Euro system. The Euro system comprises the ECB and the national centre banks of the 19 countries that have adopted the Euro. So we at the Central Bank of Ireland represent Irish citizens in the Euro system, although monetary policy decisions are made for the Euro area as a whole. All national central banks throughout the Euro area are supporting the review through research, contributions, and by facilitating this engagements just like this one with citizens across Europe. So today's event structured in two sessions. The first, we will ask you for your views on the price stability objective. And we're particularly interested in finding out what this means to you and how you feel inflation affects you and the people that you represent. The review will consider the ECB's inflation aim and how best to measure inflation. And these sorts of events are an opportunity for us to understand how price changes affect people and their behavior. And we'll also explore the main economic concerns for individuals, families, communities, and businesses. We're going to look at expectations of the economy and how the ECB can work to improve people's economic situations and their standard of living. The second session will be an opportunity for you to give us a sense of the issues that we could place more weight on. We'll seek your views on how well informed you feel about monetary policy decisions and their implementation, and how we can improve our communications. Not so long ago, successful monetary policy was believed to be mainly a matter of managing overnight interest rates effectively. And in the past, communication with the public was less of a concern for central banks. But over time, there's been an increased appreciation of the importance of communications to deliver our aims. So we've begun to communicate more as we recognize that transparency and trust are essential elements for monetary policy to be effective. Expectation setting requires a central bank to communicate clearly both its objectives and how it intends to achieve them. This requires in turn that the public understand the mission of central banks, recognize the importance of that mission, and trust in our commitment to deliver. So it does require effective central bank communication, and we'd like to hear your views on how we can do this better. And a key priority for the Central Bank of Ireland is to engage with the public and stakeholders across the whole economy, in particular to listen and learn. And better engagement helps us to understand the issues faced by businesses, households, and gives us the opportunity to understand how to enhance the performance of the financial system. Over the last year, some of my more informative meetings have been with people around the country, chambers of commerce, for example, that I visited, albeit virtually, and the regular roundtables that we've had with civil society representatives, which help to give me and my team an important insight into the wide range of issues that we have to deal with, and demonstrate how our work touches so many facets of people's lives. And this year in 2021, the key focus of our engagement and outreach activities will be to hear views on the impact of our monetary policy and communication, as well as all the other challenges ahead. So thank you very much for coming today. Thank you for all those of you who've helped us set up this event. I mean, the team within the bank has been helped by others. I'd like to thank in particular people from the Wheel for their help. And I very much look forward to listening to your views. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Governor. So I'd like to introduce Sharon Donnery, who will introduce the first discussion session of this afternoon. Sharon is the Central Bank's Deputy Governor with responsibility for central banking and is also the Governor's alternate on the Governing Council of the European Central Bank. So Sharon, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see so many people here today. And let me join the Governor in thanking you and saying that we look forward very much to the discussion. So let me talk to you just for a couple of minutes about what this first session is going to be about, which the Governor touched on already in his opening remarks, which is really a focus on our price stability objective, or effectively prices and how they change. Now, when we look at our job in central banks, we often start by looking at our legal mandates. And in this case, we look to the European Union treaties to see that they establish price stability as the primary objective of the European Central Bank. But in setting out our objective in the legislation, we aren't given a precise definition of what that means. So it's up to the ECB to define what is really meant by price stability and what is our strategy to achieve it. So as the Governor already said, the last strategy review was undertaken by the Governing Council in 2003, quite a long time ago, but it was decided at that time to aim for an inflation rate of below but close to 2% over the medium term in order to maintain price stability. I suppose at that time, though, central banks around the world were really more concerned with prices that were rising too quickly. The experiences of the 1970s and the 1980s, where inflation rates were regularly at double-digit levels, had led central banks to actively combat these big increases in the prices of goods in their economies. And that's really where the concept of our inflation aim stems from. And in general, an aim similar to that is something which is pursued by central banks all across the globe. In recent times, though, we've been more concerned about low and negative inflation rates. There's been a real shift in the direction of risks to inflation, with inflation moving below our aim for regular and quite extended periods of time. So why does that matter? Well, deflation happens when the prices of goods and services decline, and it can cause serious problems for an economy. So, for example, if consumers or customers believe that the price of a good will decline in the future, they'll hold off on making purchases of that good. And that means that the businesses face reduced demand for their goods and services, and ultimately this can lead to job losses. I suppose one of the things we'd like to hear from you today is if you have concerns about either deflation or high inflation. Is it something that impacts on you and your decisions and your organizations? Is it something that's thought about regularly in your work? Now, the definition of our inflation target, that is that we keep inflation below but close to 2%, does not mean that inflation has to be precisely at that level all the time. Basically, that would be impossible because economies are dynamic and they're open to many influences. So, for example, a drought can lead to a bad harvest. Food prices may rise as a result. There may be reduced supply, and with that, inflation. But that's only temporary. So one of the things we do is to not react to all of these temporary movements in prices. Rather, we try to understand, are these changes that are happening in the economy here to stay, or are some other changes not here to stay? And this is why we aim to steer inflation over what we call the medium term. Now, again, when we define our target as of inflation below but close to 2%, the exact definition of inflation is important. At the moment, we use something called the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices. That's basically a basket of goods that consumers buy that's harmonized all across the euro area to be representative of what consumers buy every day. But whether this basket really reflects how people feel and perceive changes in the prices of goods and services in their daily lives is really important. And it's one of the main reasons why we're hosting these listening events. Another important element is that the cost of owning a home is not currently reflected in our measure of inflation. And this has been raised in lots of other discussions that we've had about the strategy review. As we know too well in Ireland, house prices have risen quite notably in recent years, while inflation itself has stayed low. On the other hand, though, buying a house is often seen as a long-term investment, and therefore maybe not really seen to fit in with the prices of things that we buy from day to day. So we'd really like to get your view on this particular issue and how the cost of housing impacts on the perceived cost of living. Now, the second part of the questions for this session today is on your economic expectations and concerns. One of the main reasons the mandate of the ECB is price stability is because price stability helps promote a healthy economy. Stable prices help the economy to grow, and when prices are stable, they help people and businesses to plan their spending and their investment choices, and that ultimately creates jobs and prosperity. But as the Governor touched on also, there have been notable structural changes in the economy in recent years, in particular since the global financial crisis. For example, since the financial crisis, people prefer to invest in safer assets like government bonds rather than riskier ones. There's also been changes in demographics over time that have an impact on how the economy works. For example, people are living for longer and they're saving more so that they can live more comfortably in their retirement. So as a result of these things, economies are not growing as fast as they once did, which sometimes makes businesses less optimistic about the future and ultimately leads them to invest less. These developments, as well as many others, are changing how the economy works. And this has led to what we call a fall in the natural rate of interest. That's basically the interest rate at which the economy runs smoothly and at which prices are stable. And of course, traditionally, interest rates have been the main tool that central banks use to influence the economy. So if central banks increase their interest rates above this thing that we call the natural rate, it restrains growth in the economy and inflation tends to fall. Whereas if we reduce interest rates below that natural rate, the opposite happens. But because that natural rate of interest has declined, central banks have been forced to cut interest rates also. And as we've said publicly many times, interest rates are likely to remain low for some time into the future. Another example of the issues faced in the years since the financial crisis is frictions in the banking system. So, for example, when the ECB has lowered its interest rates to make loans cheaper for businesses and people, the extent and speed of the interest rate changes and how they are passed through to the banks has varied. This can mute the effects of our monetary policy and therefore impact on how we steer inflation over time. So overall, what I've tried to do in these few minutes is highlight just some of the changes that have happened in the euro area economy in recent years. It's important that we take account of these changes, but more importantly, how people feel that they have been impacted by those changes. And to make our monetary policy as effective as possible, we want to better understand your expectations and your economic concerns. How have your organisation's circumstances changed? How has COVID-19 and the resulting crisis impacted on you? What's your expectations for the economy going forward? So thanks again for joining us today, and we really look forward to hearing your views on these issues and many others over the next hour or two. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Just a reminder to everybody, if you want to be part of the conversation, if you want to make a point, please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen where you can either raise your hand or you can send us a message, as we'll need to bring you into the conversation and help you to unmute your microphone and turn on your camera as well. I do have some people who have already contacted me and want to come in. So the first person I'm going to invite in is Ivan Cooper, who is the Director of Advocacy at the Wheel. Ivan, you should be able to unmute yourself there.
Great. Okay, thank you, Ray. Will I just go ahead, Jeff?
Yep, fire away, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome and encourage the European Central Bank's efforts to engage and use more accessible language in reaching out to stakeholders for their views on monetary policy, very important. Also, just to note, just in relation to the slides that were circulated prior to the event, that we note the mandate of the ECB to pursue price stability and its current objective to maintain inflation at close to or below 2% a year. We also note that price stability is not defined, as Sharon has indicated, and we note the grounds for the strategy review, in relation to slowing economic growth and productivity, the aging population, the interest rates close to zero or negative, and global warming and digitalization and a range of other challenges. Just to note at this point that I think it's important for us to note that in practice, for people and for organizations and for society and for firms, it is really the combination, the joint combination of monetary and fiscal policy that actually matters. It's difficult to usefully consider one in isolation from the other. So just my remarks are made in that context. So what does price stability mean? In general, we think price stability is a good thing. It's certainly preferable to high or very high or hyperinflation, or indeed high, moderate or high or very high deflation. For the economy in the recent crisis, the serious risk was perceived to be economic collapse, which was successfully averted so far by unprecedented central bank asset purchases and governmental fiscal policy, and special spending programs like the wage subsidy scheme and the COVID restriction support scheme and the stability fund, indeed, for charities. So this has all been very welcome. We need to note right up front that people have been very unequally hit by the crisis, with many people able to home work and in essential occupations having been protected at the expense, indeed, of people working in exposed parts of the economy and retail and hospitality and such like, and who've been hit much, much harder. So we just need to recognise that. Many firms and organisations may not survive post-crisis, and in particular in relation to the withdrawal of supports. That said, in general terms, the economy has performed relatively well, and we have seen what states and central banks can do and can achieve when they put their mind on it and avoid austerity responses. And the lessons need to be better understood in guiding fiscal and monetary policy in the years ahead, because there's much of a positive nature that can be concluded from that. From our perspective, priorities in the period immediately ahead include: one, the avoidance of a very serious recession or indeed a depression is crucial post withdrawal of COVID special measures. And the necessary expansionary policy should permit, we believe, an over 2% inflation in relation to getting the balance right, but it must not result in sustained high inflation, or indeed the relatively low risk but not zero risk of a serious increase in inflation in the period ahead. It's very important in that context to note that supports must continue to be available for the most vulnerable and for people on fixed incomes in particular, who must be protected from any negative consequence of an uptick in inflation, which will impact them much more severely than other people in the economy. So a very close focus needs to be maintained on the relationship between fiscal and monetary policy in the context of any period of significantly increased inflation ahead. Supports must continue to be available for firms and organizations in general in negatively hit sectors of the economy and in society, and in the community and voluntary sector in particular, in relation to the impact on the economy post-COVID crisis. Fourthly, people who find themselves in long-term unemployment or in increased unemployment or in precariousness, currently potentially masked by the various schemes, must be enabled and supported to retrain and to re-enter the labour force and to find employment. And finally, the community and voluntary sector, which have played a crucial role in supporting vulnerable people and communities during the crisis, must itself be sustained through this crisis through additional special support measures as required. So over 50% of organisations in the CV sector have seen their income fall during the crisis. These organisations have often been sustained in their work by the wage subsidy schemes and the stability fund for charities. And these organisations are a crucial element of Ireland's social health and community infrastructure, without which people and communities would be left unsupported. So as you can see, my observations are just very much of a general nature in the context of both monetary and fiscal policy, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. We may contribute again later on by a general chat. So thank you for the opportunity.
Ivan, that's great. Thank you very much for that input. I'm happy to see we have a number of other people who want to come in, and more people who are putting their hands up. So again, if you want to be part of the conversation, please use the chat functionality at the bottom of the screen. The next person who is going to come in is Father Sean Healy, who is the Director of Social Justice Ireland.
Thank you for the opportunity to have this engagement, and we certainly welcome it. And we certainly think it's a positive development, and we've been part of the earlier discussions and roundtables and various other engagements, which we hope will continue and possibly multiply as we go forward. I suppose there are a number of things I want to draw attention to from our experience of what's actually happening and the concerns that we're seeing through our work. First of all, the focus very often when we talk about the central bank or whoever tends to be on the economy. And I suppose the basic one of the key conclusions we would have at this stage is that it's not just the economy needs to be looked at, but other things need to be looked at simultaneously as well. For example, we would say 4 things need to be on the agenda simultaneously with building a vibrant economy. Of course, we want a vibrant economy. Of course, we want to see good jobs, more just economic structure, good fiscal and financial stability, and sustainable economic growth, and so on. But to deliver a vibrant economy, we need decent services and infrastructure. That's critically important, decent infrastructure and services, because without them, we won't actually deliver a vibrant economy. All we have to think about is if our education system wasn't delivering people at a particular level, we wouldn't have a vibrant economy. A third thing that needs to go into place simultaneously is just taxation, because obviously if we're going to have decent services and infrastructure, these things have to be paid for, not necessarily all paid for by the taxpayer, but there has to be agreement about how they're going to be financed. We need good governance, and this is critically important because an awful lot of people at this stage are concerned that their voices aren't heard in shaping the decisions that affect them. We need to deal with that situation. Finally, the 5th area that's critically important is sustainability. If we don't have sustainability, then we obviously are wasting our time, and the vibrant economy, even if we build it, will not survive. So we need all of those 5: vibrant economy, decent services and infrastructure, good taxation, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability, and they need to be in place together. Now, to summarize it very simply, back in 1992, when he was running for the presidency of the United States, Bill Clinton had a slogan, "It's the economy, stupid," and he attributed lots of positive developments for himself to that. It seems to me that time has shown that that slogan needs to be adjusted to, "It's not just the economy, stupid." And I think that's a critical insight that needs to be taken aboard within the whole European Central Bank and the central bank here and so on. And to do that, I think if we don't do that, we're going to wind up back in difficult situations again, or in a relatively short time. Coming at it in that particular way also helps us to provide a more accurate analysis. I think we can understand that an accurate analysis is required if we're going to get the solutions that are the best that can be done to provide the kind of outcomes that we want. But to get an accurate analysis is not easy, and all we have to do is think back to the position taken in the post-bank crash response by the European Central Bank, which we certainly don't want a repetition of, and which resulted in Ireland in hundreds of thousands of people unnecessarily losing their jobs, and a sort of a too deep austerity that should never have been engaged with, and that cost us a great deal, and is still costing some sectors in society a great deal. We also, within all of that, I think need to have a particular approach, which is that the purpose of all of this and the work with the central bank and European Central Bank and all of the rest of the policy work that we do, at the end of the day, I think it's critically important in all of that to realize that what we need to do is to deliver universal access in our society for basic income and basic services for everybody, so that everybody has what's required to live life with dignity. And if we don't have that, we will have a divided society. And divided societies are not just bad for the people who are on the wrong side of the divide, they're also bad for business. So I think it would be one of the things that I think we should be all the time testing the sort of situation to ensure that the policies that are being put in place are actually going to ensure that there is universal access to basic income and basic services, so that everybody has the floor that's required. There's different ways of doing that and reaching that, but to ensure that we reach it is critically important. I think there's a number of other issues that we need to take aboard. And one of the things that I think might not get picked up at the moment is that we have a series, like a lot of focus is on COVID, and I was glad to think that to hear you say, or to hear the governor say earlier on, that he wants to take a longer term view, because we actually have a series of issues that were there pre-COVID, that are currently there, and that will be there post-COVID. For example, we have a housing crisis that's just deepening and deepening. We have healthcare issues, sort of a two-tier healthcare system that needs to be addressed, although we do welcome the strong investment in the most recent budget in the whole area of healthcare. There's childcare issues that have been highlighted by COVID, but they're there, and they were there before COVID itself. And the issue of poverty and inequality, like we would be very glad to see a reduction in the poverty levels in recent years, and in the decline in inequality. And we would point to the fact that these declines in poverty and inequality are happening because the proposals that we made and had been making for quite a number of years were actually implemented. However, we also need to face up to the fact that 12.5%, 1 in 8 of the population living in poverty, is not a good space for one of the richest countries in the world actually to be in, and it's not good enough to have a society with more than 20% of its population experiencing either poverty or deprivation, and within that having hundreds of thousands of children. And I think we have very, very serious problems there, and those problems have been exacerbated for the most part by the pandemic. So I think we need to ensure that the kind of levels of investment that are critically important and that are required are going to be there. We note that there has been a substantial increase in investment, but we all in the last budget and so on. But we also have a memory of back at the time of the Troika being here and dealing with the crash and so on. And I remember Social Justice Ireland did a policy briefing at the time on investment and the need for increased investment. And I remember sending that to the European Central Bank and the Central Bank here and a lot of others. And I remember discussing it with the Secretary General of the Department of Finance, who absolutely refused to take aboard. Everybody in the system refused to take aboard the points we were making. And our problem was, like we were pointing out, that when you looked at all of the European Union countries, we had the lowest level of investment of all of them, and that was going to generate problems up the line, or down the line in terms of in the future years. But that wasn't all. We had what really scared us was that if we doubled the level of investment, we'd still be the lowest in Europe. Now, the problem was that the analysis and so on which all of that was based was problematic, but and inaccurate in effect. And I suppose what I'm kind of arguing for here is that we have a situation going forward where we recognize that it's not just the economy stupid, that we need those kind of, for a vibrant economy, which we need, we also need decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability. And that we need to be delivering those simultaneously, not consecutively. It's not good enough anymore to say we'll get the economy right and all these things will follow. What that's a recipe for is going from boom to bust to boom to bust, a process we need to get out of. And I think we can do that if we follow an approach that basically sees these as having to be dealt with simultaneously, and that the primary among their concerns is to deliver universal access to basic income and basic services to ensure that everybody can live life with dignity. Thank you.
That's great, Sean. Thank you very much for that input. I'm happy to say we have a number of other speakers who would like to come in on this topic. So I'm actually going to move ahead now to Breed O'Brien, who is the head of policy of the Irish National Organisation of the Unemployed. Breed, you should be able to hear us there.
Great, thanks very much, Ray. And thanks very much for the invite to participate this afternoon. I mean, it was very much, it was struck when Gabriel and Sharon were talking about, you know, prices and price stability and inflation, and it nearly feels like another era. And I suppose in part we could probably all argue that maybe because of that focus, it does feel like another era. And I suppose there are challenges a range of challenges facing us, and both Ivan and Sean have elaborated on those. And one of the issues, I suppose, I just think that does need to be borne in mind is that for a lot of people trying to manage on a social welfare payment, the overall inflation figures don't necessarily reflect their cost of living. And I think what this crisis has highlighted is just the challenges facing people and the amount of people who are struggling on the incomes that they have. So I think that is an ongoing concern that I don't think necessarily an overall inflation figure captures. I was particularly struck when Sharon noted that, that housing, cost of owning a home is not included, and yet that for people, even for those who can afford to do that, that's a huge expenditure and will be the biggest item of expenditure that people will ever engage with. But I also think, just again, and Sean has mentioned this as well, just our housing policy for a number of decades has been very questionable. It has led to a situation where I think house inflation has been phenomenal, and it leads us now with a double challenge of those who bought at the high end of the market. If prices fell back to maybe where they would need to be so they will be more affordable for others, people will be left with that huge issue of negative equity. But if we don't address some of those price issues in the housing market, then we leave an awful lot of people who a couple of decades back could have well assumed that they would be able to afford their own housing and to meet that need for themselves. So a lot of our social policies are based on the assumption that people will be able to meet them and meet the costs. And I just think the way our economy has evolved over the past number of decades, that assumption does not really hold. And I think that is a very big challenge for us as a society as we move forward. One of the things, and I would imagine that other speakers this afternoon will cover this in much better. But again, it just struck me that we always talk about economic growth as if economic growth in and of itself is the bee's knees and bumps of daisies. And yet, increasingly people are questioning the model of economic growth. How sustainable is it? And then that for us then raises very big questions around jobs. Where will the jobs be? Will they be decent? And so then added to that, so that's one of the challenges that's there and is going to grow going forward. COVID, of course, has put a very large hole in the labour market. Initially, I think a lot of people assumed that everything would bounce back. Some things may well, other things won't. So again, how are we going to manage that? How are we going to ensure that people are supported to be able to get back into work and particularly to get into a decent job? How, for those who need to be reskilled, how are we going to ensure that people are supported to do that? How is that going to be covered? At an event we had this morning, one person noted that, yes, the particular training grant had doubled in the last budget and that was welcome. But some training costs have also doubled because of the costs of trying to manage some of this provision at a time of COVID. That could also be opportunism, of course, by the providers as well. So that's always, I suppose, an ongoing concern. So that was just, again, just kind of one of the challenges that I think that we do need to address as we go forward. Digitalization was mentioned in terms of some of the challenges that are facing us in the current era. That is a huge one. And I think COVID has really highlighted the particular challenges. By and large, people who've been able to work online have been able to stay employed and by and large be able to maintain their income. Others whose work is in person have found their place of work has had to close and they have lost their job and they've lost income. It may just be put on hold, but I think as this crisis continues, I think that will for an increasing number of people, that will not be the case. For people who can access stuff online, they have been able to reskill. For those who can't, they can't. And I think the limits of the smartphone have been very evident in this crisis. So that means a skills divide that we had anyway is now going to broaden. This crisis is it's highlighted the reality of it. I think it's made it very stark and the employment and income implications of that divide. But I think it really has, brought into stark contrast the wider social and economic implications of it. Because for most people, their social and economic lives are intertwined, and they're not opposite ends of the spectrum. They're often flip sides of the same coin. So I think that is a big challenge for us going forward. And we had, before this crisis hit, commentators talking about the skills the changing nature of work, the level of skills that will be required, and the investment by the state that will be required, because the scale of the change is such that the private for-profit sector will not be stepping up to the plate unless they're the really big guys. And so that kind of, I think then Sean's point that just taxation is so important. So again, just so some of those are immediate issues that COVID, I think, has really shone us a light on. Others are issues kind of over the medium to longer term. The challenge will be how Ireland addresses these issues and really does step up to the plate around it. And to ensure that also that we address the issues of income adequacy. Again, we will be very struck. The pandemic unemployment payment was set at a much higher level than existing job seekers payments. And for us, that very much identifies that existing payments are inadequate. And that issue of inadequacy needs to be addressed, because a lot of people are struggling to try and cover the cost of living. Thank you.
That's great, Breed. Thank you very much. We have a few more speakers, so I'll move next to Colette Bennett from Social Justice Ireland. Colette, you should be able to unmute and turn on your camera there.
How are you doing? Thank you so much. And again, I really welcome this opportunity to engage at this forum, so thank you so much for that. I suppose probably much of what I say will mirror what Ivan and Sean and Breed have already covered. And hopefully I'll still have something to contribute of my own. But in terms, I suppose, of when we're looking at this in a context, we're looking at it in the context of having entered this year with a significant fiscal deficit. And that has been because of very, very welcome interventions by government in terms of employee subsidies, in terms of pandemic unemployment payments, in terms of business supports, community supports, healthcare interventions, and a range of other things that are very, very welcome. However, in looking into the future, I suppose, of this, we need to be very conscious of the fact that these supports are absolutely critical, and to shut them off or cut them off kind of at a clear edge will be quite damaging, both in terms of people's incomes, in terms of businesses going to the wall, but also in terms of society generally. So there needs to be some level of tapering of those supports over time, and we need to provide for that within our economy and within our borrowings into the future, to actually ring fence what we need for now, for next year, and possibly for some of the following year in terms of the COVID specific expenditures, but also in relation to related current expenditures that go along with that, as well as existing and hopefully higher levels of service in very critical areas such as healthcare and housing and education. In terms of those supports that are very pressured at the moment, and 1 in 7 people in the population in Ireland is on some level of a welfare payment. Now that includes the data in relation to PUP. So we need to be very, very conscious of that in terms of when we look at actually what people need and how they can best support themselves and how they are going to be impacted by inflation. We have a significant proportion of the population that are currently only surviving because they are in receipt of some level of a welfare payment. We have a 25% unemployment rate. That's unprecedented. Now, obviously, again, one would hope that much of that will recover when we come through this pandemic. But there will be businesses that will not recover from this. There will be households that job losses will be significant into the future. And those households need to be provided for. We need to start looking at things like long-term training. We need to look at reskilling. We need to look at more kind of just transition programs in terms of sustainable work and what that actually means. Looking at it in the context of things like degrowth strategies for a just transition. And really ensuring that we are protecting that concept of decent work, while at the same time being very, very mindful of what we experienced as a society after the 2008 crash, that there can be no return to austerity, that the OECD and the certain cohorts of the IMF have all come out and said that is not the way forward, that is not the way to grow our economy into the future, that it actually was counterproductive, in fact. So we need to be very careful that we are not once again placing the burden of what has been a pandemic, a global crisis, onto individual households and kind of those households that can least afford it. In terms of the inflation rate and that kind of 2%, it's quite interesting. The ESRI produced a report back in March 2018, and it was looking at the impact of Brexit at the time, and it was looking at, you know, if consumer prices rose by between 2% and 3.1%, it would raise the cost of living between €892 and €1,360 a year. So we need to be very conscious when we talk about, you know, below but not too far below 2%, that still has a real impact. It is a low level, certainly, but it still has a very real impact on many households, particularly those households at the lower end of the income distribution. So when we consider things like expenditure on food, for example, on average across the state, we spend about 14.7% of our income on food. Now that increases to between 17 and 19% for the lower end of the spectrum. It increases, it's just under the 18% for those at the very bottom decile, and it's kind of similar around for the second, and then it's higher than that, it's nearly 19% for those in the third decile. Compared to then, there's kind of a sliding scale for those at the higher ends of the income spectrum. So when we talk about inflation, we need to be very conscious that it disproportionately affects households who can least afford it, who are on the lower income end of things. Again, I was quite interested in, similar to Breed, with Sharon's inputs in relation to whether or not household or housing costs should form part of, you know, the inflation piece. And certainly not alone does it have an impact on people's disposable incomes in the real sense, in terms of most people prioritize their accommodation costs, they prioritize their mortgage or their rent, they prioritize their food, then they'll prioritize costs associated with their children, and then after that look after everything else. So we just need to be very conscious in relation to what that actually means for households, and essentially what it means, it has a very real impact in terms of living expenditures. So for example, the living wage this year, now it didn't change from last year to this, or sorry, from 2019 to 2020, is €12.30 compared to a national minimum wage of €10.20. If housing costs had actually risen along the same lines as other living expenses, there'd only be somewhere between like 30 and 50 cent of a difference between the national minimum wage and the living wage. Now that is considerable when you think about, you know, the fact that our living wage is so far above what many people on the national minimum wage are actually earning. So it's having a real difference for them. So it's just, as I suppose, in relation to bearing these things in mind and what kind of an impact they're actually having. Like we've seen, for example, in relation to the living wage, when the work was done behind that, things such as household goods and services and food and personal care, they all decreased. But because of the increase in housing costs and transport and clothing, we're still seeing that gap. So we need to be very, very mindful in that when we're looking at fiscal policy, that there is, again, that income gap. There is, as Sean said, over 12% of the population living in poverty. Almost 200,000 of those are children. We have seen the impact of our two-tiered healthcare system, particularly now. We've seen the fact that there will be a huge educational disadvantage for those who have already pre-pandemic experienced that. So children with special needs, children who are going to day schools, the amount of time that they have spent outside of the classroom is not only going to affect their level of education, it's going to affect their employment prospects into the future. And there was a study done showing that for every block of time that they are excluded from the educational setting, that is actually a potential decrease in their earnings potential. So, you know, that obviously then will have a knock-on effect for the economy into the future. So, you know, I just think that we need to be very mindful of what went wrong the last time and what we need to structure our society around this time. Thank you.
Colette, thank you very much. That's great. I'm just conscious I have a number of other speakers that would like to come in, and we obviously have a second part of this session as well. So I'm going to maybe start interrupting people once they kind of get to the 5 or 6 minute point, if that's okay, just to ensure that everybody gets the opportunity to speak. The next person that I have is Paul Chanel, who is the Director of the European Anti-Poverty Network. Paul, you should be able to unmute yourself there.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for the opportunity to input. I think a lot of the points I will be making were already made by previous speakers, so I won't be long. Just one of the points that has been made is in relation to the different approach that's been taken this time around in relation to the current crisis to the previous crisis. We would have been among those organisations who met with the Troika back during the last period of crisis. And it was one of the ECB was I suppose the organisation that's most difficult to deal with in relation to their approach to austerity. They were very convinced that that was the approach that needed to be taken at the time. And we can see since then the damage that has caused to society more broadly. So we very much welcome a different approach this time and a focus on investment this time around. I just think in relation to that, maybe the ECB or the central bank already has a process of social proofing its own policies and its own approach, but I very much think that that would be a way to go in terms of it, looking at how it implements policy. I think it was interesting in terms of the headline you put up in relation to the main contribution to central bank to make improving people's welfare is maintaining price stability. I think the issue of improving people's welfare is the key point in relation to that. So a social proofing of policy is a very important way that the ECB and the central bank can improve people's lives and maintain people's quality of life. The other issue is in relation to inflation and the cost of living, which is already raised. So a lot of people have raised the point that currently and Breed in particular, that the current social welfare rates and even the current national minimum wage is not adequate for people to meet the cost of living. So even before the current crisis, we had a situation between 2018 and 2019 that material deprivation went from 15.1% to 17.8%. That was a pre-COVID crisis. So that shows that there are already quite a number of people in our society who are struggling to make ends meet, who can't afford the cost of living. So when it comes to changes then in inflation, that has an immediate effect on people on very low and fixed incomes. So the issue of inflation is very relevant in terms of how the central bank sets and looks at it, addresses the issue of inflation, because it has an immediate effect on people on low incomes. So the issue of housing is one of the core ones of those. So when it came to the material deprivation, it was the inability to afford accommodation was a key item in relation to people's inability to make ends meet and force them into deprivation. And Colette was highlighting that point in particular. So I think I'll leave it at that. So the key issue would be, 2 points would be in relation to social proofing of policy by the central bank and the European Central Bank, and also in terms of maintaining price stability and inflation, that the current welfare levels are not based on what people need to meet the cost of living. They're based on political decisions or other decisions, but they're not set or benchmarked against the current cost of living, and neither are the national minimum wages. So that's something that needs to be considered in relation to addressing the issue of inflation and price increases. Thank you.
That's great, Paul. Thank you very much. The next speaker that I have is Caroline White, who is an ecological economist with FASTA, which is the Foundation for the Economics of Stability. Caroline, you should be able to unmute yourself there.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be invited to participate, and thank you for this event in general. It's very, very useful. So I realise that the ECB has a mandate that it needs to follow, And I'd agree with what Ivan Cooper said earlier, that fiscal policy is as important as monetary policy. The two need to balance each other out. I also think that the ECB's mandate is somewhat contradictory, and I think that's something that needs to be discussed among the central bankers, yourselves, and with politicians as well. I was very happy to hear Sharon Donnery mention that you're taking a more medium-term approach to achieving price stability. I think unpredictably fluctuating price levels can make it harder for anyone to plan for the future. At the same time, we're facing a future in which the energy transition away from fossil fuels will probably have a strong impact on prices. To use an analogy, it's as if we're all in an airplane, we're high in the sky, we're running out of fuel, and we need to descend smoothly and land in a safe place. And that's the priority. This is an existential matter. Climate disruption is existential. Biodiversity collapse is existential. So if we try to keep the plane at the same altitude in the short term, trying to keep overall prices stable in the short term, we won't have very good results. In the medium to longer term, when we've landed the plane, then we can prioritize price stability again. Although I'd actually think it's a bit of a confusing goal. I'd consider overall financial stability to be a more meaningful and realistic permanent goal, but that's another whole issue. And just to give a concrete example, for example, if you've got a shortage of the raw materials you need for battery production, then prices for the batteries will naturally rise and the economy is going to need to adjust to that. And if you try to prevent that adjustment, that could be harmful, and it might even exacerbate any instability that's being triggered by the energy transition. So instead, we need to find ways to protect the vulnerable from more adverse effects of these kinds of price changes, which others have already mentioned, which I totally agree with. I very much agree with what Ivan Cooper and Sean Healy mentioned about this, and particularly the need for universal basic services and universal basic income as a way to help cushion the energy transition. Again, this is a thing between fiscal and monetary policy to be worked out. I'm not saying it's all the central bank's, mandate. So the effects of price changes, I would say, are strongest for the things that are essential for survival, energy, food, housing, just to answer your question about that. And how relevant do I find the increase in the cost of housing? I'd say extremely relevant, as has also been pointed out already by Breed O'Brien, absolutely. And what's interesting about housing costs is that there's a strong cultural component, if you like. It's got to do with taxation, all kinds of different things. It isn't, as Cousin Dryder say, energy. Energy, there's a thermodynamic component, if you like, to that. There's certain things that you can't adjust. Housing, I think there's a lot to be done, and a lot that could be done with housing prices. In terms of economic concerns that we're facing, I'm sure you're very much aware there's a lot of criticism of central banks' behavior in the fairly recent past in terms of indirectly or directly bailing out polluting industries with emergency bailout measures and subsidies to fossil fuel companies and so on. Personally, I would see these things as actually symptomatic of a deeper problem. And I think the problem is basically the financial system is very dependent on credit demand in order to be able to function. And in turn, credit demand is very dependent on GDP growth. And this has also come up earlier as well. Is growth a viable goal? And in practice, people and firms tend to not want to go into debt unless they think the economy is doing well enough for them to be able to pay back those debts. And that generally means economic expansion. That's what's going to motivate people to take on debt. Unfortunately, though, the scientific literature indicates that decoupling aggregate GDP growth from environmental degradation in absolute terms is extremely difficult, if not impossible, as not something we should bet our future well-being on. It really isn't. So the financial system needs to be made recession-proof, and this is the challenge. And I think it's a conversation that really needs to happen. Concerns, I guess my concern there is that governments and central banks won't be able to perceive that we need to think about a recession-proof economic system, financial system, a system that can deal with economic contraction without collapsing and without needing to have firefighting measures brought in hurriedly to try and prop up the economy, and which have all kinds of adverse social and environmental effects. So I'd be very reassured if I knew this was being discussed seriously. I know there is a credibility issue with central banks, and I know there are things that can and can't be said publicly, but I think it would be very good to know that this is something that's just being discussed and being taken seriously as an issue. I think that's all of the questions that you had in this. So thank you very much. I'll leave it to somebody else now. Thank you.
That's great, Caroline. Thank you very much. I'm going to come next to Pat Denigan, who is the CEO of Focus Ireland. Pat, you should be able to unmute yourself there.
Thanks indeed, Ray, and thanks indeed for the chance to participate in this. I know you have a lot of contributors. I'll try and be as brief as I can. I just want to focus on probably three different areas, if you don't mind. And one, I suppose, no prizes for guessing, is around the whole area of housing and rents. And and I would noted with interest there Deputy Governor Sharon's comment at the start about that the cost of rent or the cost of the housing provision is not included in the calculation of inflation in the medium term. And I understand that the provision of housing is typically a long-term goal, but I suppose the financing of that and the funding for the provision of housing typically comes from someone's current income. So there's a kind of a bit of a contradiction there. And I suppose if we were to and I haven't seen a number that someone has tried to calculate what the inflation rate would be if housing and the provision of a home was to be included in it, but I suspect it would be considerably over 2%. And that is causing an awful lot of difficulties in the housing market, in the private rented market for people who are tenants, but also in the market for people who are trying to buy. And there's two things that we've noted. One more longer term and one that we noted quite recently in that, in the sense that zero or negative indeed interest rates are having a kind of an unusual impact in that what we're seeing is institutional investors are now turning to the social housing and residential market for a return. And where previously they would have been buying maybe large apartment blocks and items of that nature, they're now looking at scattered housing and using it as a provision for social housing in the regions and in Dublin, which is driving up prices. And the return from that they're getting is what they regard as almost a gilt-edged return in the HAP payments from the state. And the impact of that is really to build up a dependency on HAP and the housing assistance payment and a dependency on that state payment into the future, because people are simply unable to provide both save for the deposits and save for the future and also pay the rents. So we see that as a fundamental issue, which is also impacting on the supply of housing and the ability of people to get on that housing ladder. If you take that into a more long-term view as well, it struck me when looking at the slides in preparation for this, a lot of people, particularly in Ireland, I suppose, have had a long-held ambition to be homeowners, to own their own home, and it's part of our tradition maybe. But it's also part of our kind of, I suppose, financial prudence in long-term savings, in that people regard when they get to the end of their career, they'll have their house paid off and they'll be able to, their mortgage paid off, and they'll be able to live unencumbered. If people are looking at long-term rent and renting into the long term, perhaps throughout their career, that option and that stability won't be available to them. And I think that needs to be taken into account as part of the vulnerability people have in terms of housing and the vulnerability we all have in terms of pension provision. What also, I suppose, maybe somewhat related to that is also the fact that in the area of pensions, I mean, this isn't my area, but maybe it's my area in terms of my age. When we get to a certain period in our life and in our career, some of our pension providers move us from more what's regarded as more risky type investments into more stable investments. And if the returns on those stable investments, typically in the past been government gilts and bonds, is as low as it is or zero, obviously that's not going to help when we're providing for our pensions in the future. And maybe that impact in the medium term of interest rates on that inflation rate is something that we could consider. And the last item I just wanted to cover, and it relates also to some of the previous contributors, and it's around the whole area of post-COVID and the risk of a post-COVID type austerity. From the point of view of the community and voluntary sector, from the point of view of non-government agencies in the area of social care and others like ours, we have actually never been back at a level of funding that's required. And organisations like ourselves depend heavily on the provision of fundraising and being able to fundraise. And in order to have a sustainable and continuous not-for-profit sector and a continuous level of service, an appropriate level of service, that deficit needs to be addressed. And it's a deficit that exists pre-COVID and continues to exist today. And it's something which is of a fundamental bearing on the sustainability of many organisations who depend on their fundraising arms currently. But thanks for the opportunity of contributing, and I'll hand you back to yourself, Ray.
That's great, Pat. Thanks very much, and thanks for your input. The final speaker that I have in this section is Wayne Stanley, who's the Head of Policy and Communications at Simon Communities Ireland. And then following Wayne, I might ask Sharon Donnery just to wrap up this section. And if you haven't had an opportunity to speak yet, we will have another opportunity for discussion in the next segment, which will be led by Mark Cassidy. But Wayne, I might ask you to come in if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Ray, and thanks for the opportunity and for the invitation today. I think obviously the virtue of going last is everybody's made a lot of your points, and certainly I'd echo a lot of all of what Pat said there. They're all very important issues. I think in terms of the current, I suppose, monetary policy and inflation, I think one of the things currently that we think is that there's a huge opportunity with the very low interest rates at the moment, and particularly the interest rates that governments can borrow at. The investment in infrastructure, and particularly in housing infrastructure, and again, Simon Community, that's no surprise, offers us an opportunity as a way out of some of the difficulties that we're in. As we come out of the COVID crisis, if there is an economic hit, and there are welcome signs that there's a buildup of savings in some sectors that might help to kickstart the economy as well, and we all try to be optimistic, but there's a good chance that with the level of spending that's been required to get us to this stage, that there will be a state might pull back on spending, and it could be in the social sector that we start to see the impact on that. And I think for us it's really worrying because it's low-income households who are in the private rented sector are in that pinch point, and they're particularly the families that will end up, and the single people that will end up in homelessness, are the ones who are particularly vulnerable and at risk there. So there's a combination of factors there that if it was to play out in a certain way, the post-COVID economic experience, we could see another spike in homelessness. I think the housing being included in the inflation rate is particularly important, because I think housing is more and more becoming important as social infrastructure. The value of a home has never been questioned. It's always been important to people in Ireland, but as economic and social infrastructure in modern economies, I think it's more and more important. And certainly as a moral and as a health and as a human resource, the current pandemic has shown just how important it is, and that needs to be held on to. It's also important to say that the crisis in housing has been often acknowledged to be a lack of supply, but in truth it's an affordability crisis. And I think that's where the inflation comes in, is the inclusion of housing in that, and actually the need for deflation in the cost of housing, both in to buy, but particularly in the rental. And that came out of the pinch point of where we are now, came out of decisions that were made in 2011 around how they were going to respond to negative equity and the housing crisis, the collapse of what was seen as the collapse of the housing system. Decisions that were made there to kind of reinflate the housing market were made on the fiscal side to try and reinflate the cost of land and the cost of housing to make it to draw people back into the system and create movement. What they didn't realize was that what that did was created pinch points, because building didn't catch up. And actually what it commodified housing, and there's a lot of interests that are served by keeping housing rates of build low and keeping costs high. And it calls for, I think, a level of intervention that not all states are comfortable with. But if we look to other models like in Vienna, in Austria, where you see housing inflation is kept almost flatlined or at that 1 and 2%, because they do have significant state intervention that they've built over a long time. I'd agree with, I think, Colette's point around the difference between the living wage if housing inflation had been kept at a low level. I think is a stark reminder of that and a very good example. And the final thing I would say is, again, looking back to the learning from the last crisis is homelessness really started to grow from 2011, not from 2008 when the crisis hit. So it's oftentimes when the upturn comes and things should be improving that inflation comes along with growth. And particularly if it's localized in particular areas in the way that it was in housing, it's the most vulnerable that are hit. And it's at that point when we started to emerge from the last crisis that actually homelessness increased. So the monitoring of it, I think, is incredibly important, in ensuring that we have the right economic and fiscal policies to counteract that, and the indicators there to identify it quickly and address it in our social policy and in our economic policy would be absolutely critical. Thanks very much, Ray.
Thanks very much, Wayne, and thank you everybody for your contributions. That was a really great session. I might ask Deputy Governor Donnery to come back in and maybe to reflect some of the thoughts she had during that session, some of the things that she has heard. Sharon.
Thanks, Ray. Just let me start by saying really thank you to everyone. A huge range of contributions, all really, really interesting and very much appreciate, I think, the open way in which you've shared your on-the-ground experience. Some of our team who are working on the review are on the call with us today. So let me just assure you that, you know, all of the issues that you've raised have been captured, and we will look at them and consider them all very carefully. But maybe just a couple of themes, and in the interest of time, I won't spend too long on this because we do want to move on to the other session, but a couple of themes and main issues maybe that I took away. So I would say sort of whole set of issues around price stability itself, prices and inflation, and particularly some of the distributional effects for how changes in prices affect different groups differently, and particularly across the income distribution. A whole set of issues around housing costs and how they're considered or not considered as part of inflation, be that rental or ownership costs. And then I would say a whole set of sort of wider issues about the economy more broadly, about economic resilience and how we get through tough times in the economy, financial stability, climate change, the wider housing issues, including housing affordability and the need for investment in housing infrastructure and pensions and savings. Quite a lot on fiscal interaction, so fiscal and monetary interaction, but also on the important role of fiscal policy in providing supports post-COVID and the need for that not to be withdrawn too quickly. But also the wider role of the state in the economy and other issues like the opportunity for investment in infrastructure that might arise in the low interest environment. And then a range of other issues on our model of economic growth, how we measure economic growth, how we think about growth from a sustainability perspective and a well-being perspective, and then a range of issues around, I suppose, what I would call social policy, inequality, living wage, distributional and income issues. So I think very, very large numbers of those issues already being considered by us as part of the review, or are additional ones that we're happy to consider. But I think also more broadly for us, really interesting in the context, not just of our monetary policy mandate, but our wider mandate. So just to remind again, I mean, the purpose for today is really for us to listen to you and to hear your concerns, to make sure that we factor them in as part of this review and that they get discussed and get debated. We don't have time for me to sort of respond to all of these issues in detail and to talk to you and engage with you a bit more. But again, let me assure you they'll all be taken away, and we will have opportunities, I hope, over the coming year where we can pick up on many of these issues, either as part of the outcome of the review itself or as part of our other engagements on things like housing and the bank's mortgage measures, for example, or some of the other work we do. So really, thanks again for all the interventions. I'll hand back to Ray now and we can move on to the next session. Thank you.
That's great, Sharon. Thank you very much. So as Sharon mentioned, we are going to move on to the second part of today's session, and it now gives me pleasure to introduce Mark Cassidy. Mark will introduce this second session, and Mark is a Director of Economics and Statistics here at the bank. Mark, if I can hand over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Ray, and good afternoon, everybody. And let me also thank you all for joining us today and a really interesting and useful first session. So this second session will cover two items. First, what we have called other topics, and then second, how we communicate with you. So in the first part of the session, we'd like to hear about other issues that matter to you that you think the ECB should be taking into consideration. And many such issues have been raised during that first session. And as Deputy Governor Donnery highlighted, the ECB's primary objective, it is price stability. But while price stability takes precedence in monetary policy implementation, there are other objectives that can be supported by the ECB. And more specifically, the EU treaties say that without prejudice to the objective of price stability, the euro system shall also support the general economic policies in the EU with a view to achievement of the objectives of the Union. And these objectives include issues such as full employment and balanced economic growth, among others. Incidentally, the ECB, with its primary mandate for price stability, this differs from some other central banks, most notably maybe the US Federal Reserve. It has a dual mandate of both price stability and full employment. And while the EU treaty does not allow for us, the ECB, to change our mandate, a question is, what credence do you think the ECB should give to those other objectives, such as full employment or balanced economic growth? Another example is financial stability. This was also raised during the earlier discussion, and while the treaties do not contain a precise definition of financial stability, monetary policy decisions that are taken to maintain price stability can also impact on financial stability. So, for example, over the past year, the monetary policy decisions taken by the ECB, they've helped to calm the financial market stress amid the COVID-19 crisis. They've eased borrowing conditions for governments and for businesses. And that lowering of interest rates should help to promote price stability, as those governments and firms are now able to borrow at lower interest rates and will be encouraged to make investments. But the low interest rate environment and other monetary policy instruments, they may also have effects on risk-taking and prices in financial markets that can impact on financial stability. So a second question, I suppose, is, do you have any views on the weight that should be given to financial stability, even if it is not the primary objective of monetary policy? And then more generally and beyond the real economy and financial stability, are there any other objectives that you think the ECB should pursue? So one issue that is becoming increasingly important, of course, is the critical issue of climate change, and Caroline highlighted this very well in her earlier intervention. This is also an area where ECB President Christine Lagarde has been quite vocal, as have many other central bank policymakers around the world. But I think there is still some uncertainty over the role that the ECB can or indeed should play on this front. So is it appropriate for central banks to target climate change policies, given that we are then making decisions to allocate public resources? But on the other hand, it could also be seen as supporting EU policies, since, as per the European Commission, by 2050, Europe aims to become the world's first climate neutral continent. So should the ECB actively support the actions of the EU to mitigate climate change through its policies? And if so, do you have any views on how central banks might be able to act against climate change? So the second part of the session then, we'd like to look at central bank communication. And in particular, we'd like to know your opinions on how the ECB communicates its monetary policy strategy and decisions, how well you understand what is being communicated, and what we might be able to do to improve upon this. So the ECB Governing Council, it meets every 6 or 7 weeks to make its monetary policy decisions. When the monetary policy meeting has concluded, the ECB will issue a press release that contains the details of those decisions. This press release will outline the benchmark interest rates that will be applied to refinancing operations conducted by the ECB for the period to come, along with any other relevant monetary policy instruments. Then on the same day, shortly after the press release is issued, the ECB President and Vice President will then host a press conference, and at that press conference, the President explains the rationale for the monetary policy decisions and provides details of the economic assessment that has been made by the Governing Council informing these decisions. And once every 3 months, economic forecasts are also released as part of that press conference. and they outline the Governing Council's expectations for the future path of inflation and output. And more generally, I suppose, central bank communications have grown significantly in importance in the conduct of monetary policy. And it is important that this communication is transparent, that it is understood by those with whom the central bank is communicating, and this must include the public. But successfully explaining to and engaging with and educating the public, it's more than just a matter of removing the jargon from our communication. We do need to make sure that we are transparent in our communication, of course, but also that we are making the use of the most effective channels that are available to communicate our policy to the public in a manner that is simple, well understood, and can be clearly defined. So in this regard, I think credibility is crucial for what we call the expectations channel of monetary policy. For while it is important that the central bank signals its expectations for prices and interest rates, the public must also have confidence and believe in these. And credibility then requires that a central bank's objectives are clearly defined and that it is independent in pursuing these objectives. Expectation setting therefore requires a central bank to clearly communicate both its objectives, but also how it intends to achieve them. And this requires in turn that the public understands the mission of central banks, that it recognizes the importance of that mission, and that it trusts in the commitment of the central bank to deliver upon that. And all of that, of course, requires effective central bank communication. So while this strategy review, obviously it's a massive undertaking by the ECB, it could ultimately change how monetary policy will be implemented going forward, but it will also be particularly important at the end of it to communicate the outcomes of the review to people. So it is important for us to try to understand how we could better or best engage with you as representatives of the public. So we would like to get your views on how well you think the ECB communicates on monetary policy. One obvious example, I think, is the COVID-19 crisis. How well informed do you feel, have you felt about the stimulus measures taken by the ECB in the wake of the pandemic, maybe as it was happening first around March or April of last year, and even now close to a year later? Are you better informed? More broadly, we would like to hear your views on how the ECB could go about explaining the inflation target and the reason behind it. Do you understand the risks associated with inflation being too high or too low? Do you think people generally understand this? It was touched upon earlier, but we would like to know how communication with you of those risks could be improved. So how do we close the gap in communication? Do you pay attention? Are you aware of the monetary policy decisions taken by the ECB Governing Council? And in your opinion, what can we do, I suppose, to improve our communications? So at that, let me hand over to Ray. We very much look forward to hearing your views and your perspectives on these important issues. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mark. And just to remind everyone, the mechanics for this session are exactly the same as the last one. If you can use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand or to drop us a comment, and we can bring you into the conversation. So actually, the first person that I have who wants to give us an input on this section is Donald McManus, Donald, CEO of the Irish Council for Social Housing. Donald, you should be able to unmute yourself there.
Thanks very much, Chair, and you can hear me okay?
All good.
Okay, there are two issues here which are interrelated on communication. The first one is basically the strategic mandate of the ECB. And again, I'm not quite sure a lot of people understand the full mandate of the ECB at a strategic level. And the one thing I would say is, we feel sometimes central banks and the ECB are behind the curve in terms of regulation. For instance, in recent years, as I mentioned before, there's been a huge wave of almost shadow banking. We have a lot of these overseas international funds coming into jurisdictions who are not regulated by domestic banks or domestic central banks or within the ECB itself. And that is a concern because it is affecting things like property prices, land prices, for instance, and the level playing field sort of is manifested in domestic banks have various liquidity requirements, Basel ratios to fulfill, loan to value and so forth, gearing ratios, whereas international funds don't have that. So you have a parallel system of a regulated European system and this other system overseas financial institutions which don't have to comply with that. So I think they're the sort of things in terms of your strategy looking forward. Is that going to be part of the oversight, bringing in more of the non-domestic financial bodies? If it is, then that needs to be made clear to tell people what you do and what you don't do, what national governments do and what they don't. So I think that there's a broader strategic communication linked to that there. And I think it's very much around this idea of your limited mandate when you can and can't do. But that has been a trend over the last 10, 15 years. You've seen these shadow banking arrangements that aren't covered by the Financial Services Centre and so forth, and your own remit. So I think that needs to be closely looked at, and that is an evolution. These funds tend to be short-term extractive funds and not long-term investment in our situation. I think the other thing in a more operational level is in terms of communicating things like when press statements come out, they talk about that interest rates have changed, and people are trying to weigh up, well, my mortgage rate is still at 2.5%, 3%, and then we have rates to do with deposit rates are at 0 or -0, and I think that needs to be communicated more clearly. What is the anomaly in that situation? Is it a domestic situation with in a member state, and what's the ECB's feeling on that? So I think there, at an operational level, I think communication needs to be ramped up to explain to people these anomalies between ECB rates and also domestic rates as well. So they're the two key issues. I would say, I think on the wider issue of non-regulated funds, there certainly is displacement of domestic funds. And look, it was helpful at 2011, 2012 when we needed international funds to get things going. That cycle has moved on now. And I'd be concerned that displacement will affect land prices in particular. And that's because we're moving into an era of urbanization throughout the European Union. That is going to be we're in for a decade of debt potentially in the housing field as well. And I do think finally that the ECB has a role in enabling and supporting different financial bodies in the green agenda. We already see the European Investment Bank, which is like the green bank in Europe. That's been very positive in the housing sector in Ireland, bringing through very low rates from yourselves to the EIB, and that should continue. That's a real touchstone and delivers more housing at better prices. So there are just a few comments on a strategic level and an operational level, and thanks to yourself and ECB or the Central Bank for the invitation.
Thanks very much, Donal. Again, just to remind people, if they want to come in, if you can just raise your hand, please, and we'll bring you into the conversation. I might ask my colleague Gillian Phelan just to come in on that last input from Donal, and you might maybe have a couple of follow-up comments on that.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Hi, Donal. I mean, I thought you made some really valuable comments, and particularly, you know, they're right to the heart of what we're hoping to get some insight in terms of, you know, communication and central bank communication and so on. And in ways, you're right. I mean, there is a recognition in central banking circles that, you know, we've been quite effective in communicating with financial markets, a little bit less effective with kind of academic audiences, and by degree, it's a little less effective by the way we get all the way down to the public. So there is a recognition that we probably need to do some work there. So I mean, you gave a good example of you know, the difference in rates in terms of what the ECB has and then what we pay on our mortgage and so on. So I was going to ask you, I mean, a question. I mean, how do you think we could better go about communicating those kind of messages, and what's the best way to reach out to people? I mean, is it sessions like this, or I mean, would you have any ideas in terms of how we can better go about this kind of outreach aspect? I mean, we'd be delighted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is one thing that's to reach a certain audience, but it's not going to reach the wider audience of, and that maybe need to be almost educated through the banks themselves. You see in other jurisdictions where you have a requirement on financial bodies to explain all this information in quite heavy. I know in the US, in terms of any affordable homeowners, they're told in detail about this, and maybe there could be some obligation on banks to make sure. I know you have that already. There's obligations on banks to do that as part of your mandate, but I think it needs to go a bit deeper. You know, when people are taking out almost a heavier type of induction in terms of taking out a mortgage, but also taking out rates. So I think there's a couple of fronts. I don't think it's one thing in particular. I think this audience will hear we can stretch into our membership and our organizations, but I think the wider public, because you have things like on mortgages, like 70% of the country are homeowners, you know, so we need to think, well, that's on TV or whatever, but it needs to be a wider platform than just us. I think it needs to reach into the banks, but also into a wider technological platform as well. And it doesn't come across as very clear sometimes, you know, but that gulf between interest rates at 2.5% and we're paying minus deposit rates as well. And people are saying, well, how can we rationalize that? Okay, the banks have problems with liquidity. So I think there's a number of platforms you need to take on that. This audience will help, but we're only a messenger to other people. I think you need to get the heart of the citizens, the people in the country, and that may be a audio-visual or constantly keep reassuring people. Like we've, you look at the COVID experience, people are fairly well au fait with information around COVID. That was explained fairly well and rationalized, but I think it needs to go down to, you know, the consumer, what they have in their pocket and what it costs to pay a mortgage and what they're getting in the bank. It needs to go down as detailed as that.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Julian, and thanks, Donal. Ivan Cooper from The Wheel was going to come in next. Ivan.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. And just building on a few points that Sean referenced there. So, I mean, there is just something, just again, to congratulate the bank in relation to the reach out initiatives. They are good. You know, the comms effort has to start, and this is a start. I think I agree with Sean. You know, it doesn't have to be really complicated. There are, you know, the communications unit has upped its game in the central bank. So I think that there are ways that we can more regularly communicate. Totally support Sean's point about the willingness to engage in the underlying analysis. I think that's crucial because we started out, you know, there's a certain arbitrary distinction made and an arbitrary division between monetary policy and fiscal policy. The two of them are fundamentally related, and really one can't operate and isn't able to operate in, you know, in the context of the absence of the other. So there's an artificial distinction there that can sometimes cause a lot of this conversation that happens, the crucial aspects of the conversation. If we were to have restricted today's conversation only to the questions that were posed, it would have been a much narrower conversation than has actually taken place, which has been a wide-ranging conversation. So we just need to recognize that. 3 points. One, you know, we need to de-jargonize economic, fiscal, monetary, the language of policymaking in those areas. It is, you know, the language is disabling, I'm saying, it's intimidating, it's exclusionary, and it doesn't have to be that way. It's become more and more like that as the language has become more and more refined in particular areas of policy making, and it disables people, educated people, able people, from feeling they have an ability to articulate the issues as they see them, which can be done very effectively as we've done today. So some work, I think there's a role for the central bank in relation to engaging around financial literacy and education, you might call it more generally. There's a big theme there, so I'd encourage the central bank to look at that, look at working with the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, look at working with academia, look at working with schools, find ways of getting the story, the way people understand being in the world and what's involved in work, what's involved in earning, what's involved in paying, what's involved in saving, simple stuff. Give people the language and the ability to take part. It's not complicated, but we cause it to be much more complicated than it needs to be. People are well able to understand and take part in economic discussions if they have the confidence of feeling that they have an ability to express themselves in a way that they'll be understood. Second piece, there's just a piece around coming back to the financial inclusion piece. This is the general, what other topics matter. Financial inclusion more broadly is an issue. Access to bank accounts, you know, the pandemic has resulted in cash almost disappearing from day-to-day transactional purposes. Cohorts of people out there who don't have access to bank accounts and cards, and how important that's going to be. So again, just to look at the uptake in relation to the standard bank accounts. What's the story there? We need some research on that. I think the bank needs to put a little bit of energy and attention into that one. So they're kind of the 3 points: de-jargonizing the language, financial literacy and education, focusing in on that, and financial inclusion. Thanks very much, Ray.
Thanks, Ivan. Thank you. The last person that I have who has put their hand up to speak is Colette Bennett. Colette, hopefully you are there. And once Colette has finished, I might ask the Governor to come in with some thoughts and some reflections on what he has heard this afternoon. So Colette, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Yeah, I suppose Ivan stole some of my thunder there, but certainly in relation to that whole area of financial literacy, there was a report undertaken by Task last year that showed just how lacking that was. That people were entering into quite contracts. And didn't understand the implications of it. So things like PCP agreements, where there's a massive balloon payment at the end, that wasn't readily understood by many people. They just saw kind of a lower ongoing rate. And this would have been an area I was involved in the policy side of debt advice for almost a decade. And it would have been something that came up over and over again for us. So I think, it was included in the roadmap to social inclusion. It was something that came up at the roundtable the year before last with the central bank around that financial education and that need for an independent body to really undertake some proper financial education. Now, I know that the CCPC has been doing some work in that area, but that needs to be bumped up a bit. Also in relation to the bank accounts, the basic bank account that was introduced, probably 5 years ago, maybe even a little bit more. The uptake on that wasn't very high at the time. And the reason for that was because banks were not promoting it. In fact, there was some undercover research done on it, going bank to bank to see could you access it. And it was actually incredibly difficult to get access to it, to get any information on it, because banks have turned into salespeople that rather, back in 2008, everybody became a debt collector. Since kind of 2015, everybody became a salesperson. And it was all about recouping that money again and opening bank accounts that cost, as opposed to engaging with those who are financially excluded and are excluded from banking facilities, and engaging with them around the basic bank account and even interacting with people who would be marginalized generally. So for example, I know of a case because I was engaged with it myself, where someone had a real difficulty accessing a basic bank account because they couldn't provide the proofs because they were on a transition period out of prison. The proofs that are there are very, very broad, but the banks themselves didn't understand the legislation. So, it was up to me and my colleagues to actually interpret the legislation for the bank staff so that they could actually operate within the guidelines that were there for them to open a bank account for this person. Another way, I suppose, of looking at it, and Gillian referenced, and it could just have been a turn of phrase, Gillian, so I understand that, but referenced all the way down to the public. If you view the public as being stratified and they're at the bottom of your stratification for information, then you're going to concentrate on the financial markets, you're going to concentrate on your national banks, you're going to concentrate on perhaps people in the sector, and then all the way down you're not probably focusing on, well, what actually communication strategy do they need, because we're all stakeholders in the banking sector. We all are affected by it. We're all either affected by the policies around it or by the fact that we have mortgages or bank accounts or loans or whatever else. So it really is important to engage with everybody at the level of stakeholder. And to that end, like the central bank have had some really good successes in terms of the types of promotions they have done. I don't think anybody above a certain age can forget I don't know what a tracker mortgage is, the man at the top of the bus. That's a highly successful advertising campaign. It was really informative, it was really simple, and it got quite a complicated product across in a really good way. So you have that track record there already, and it's something that really should be explored in greater detail for things like that, for these strategies, so that people understand what they are, why they're coming into place, and what it means for me and my pocket, essentially. Thank you.
Colette, thank you very much, and thanks to Ivan and Sean as well, and actually thanks to everybody who participated today and gave us their thoughts and their inputs. It's been a really, really valuable session. I'm going to pass over now to Governor McCloof to make some final remarks and to share with us some of the themes that he has pulled out of the discussion today. Governor.
Thanks, Ray, and thank you everybody for really a very, very interesting set of comments, not just in this last session, but just throughout the afternoon. I personally have found it just really useful to just sit back and listen to what people have been saying. And as Sharon indicated earlier, I mean, we're certainly going to take these and think about them very carefully, make absolutely certain that we'll input them into the review. And I would like at some point to come back, whether it's at the end of the review, and tell you how we got to the whatever conclusions we get to, or just generally. I mean, some of the issues that were raised, I think, deserve further discussion generally. I mean, just if I can just pick out probably three particular things that I heard in this session, which I'd just like to sort of reflect on. And I'll just be extremely brief. One, and I can't remember who made this point, but I wrote it down. I don't think that economic growth as we currently define it, is automatically bad. I think it can be. I think you can have good growth of the sort that we need to improve the living standards of the community. It almost certainly needs to be slightly different growth to what we've been used to in the past. But so I don't personally believe in the so-called degrowth agenda. But I do think there's something about changing the way we understand growth traditionally, and I've talked about that in the past, certainly in previous jobs. Secondly, someone made the point that about avoiding recessions, avoiding financial recessions. Could I just say that from the central bank's perspective, if we get our policies right, we both avoid recessions and we avoid booms. And that's the big challenge for central bankers. And it is absolutely how fiscal policy interacts with monetary policy is an incredibly important thing. And they are different things. And central banks, the European Central Bank, is not allowed to essentially fund governments. And there is deliberately a distinction between monetary and fiscal policy. But the two, in economic terms, absolutely interact. And one of the things we're going to be looking in this review is, how has that been happening, and what can we learn from it, and what does it mean for the future? The final point I'd like to just comment on, because I agree with it so much, I just feel sort of obliged to to just make explicit my endorsement, is I think it was Ivan who talked about the de-jargonizing of the language. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. I thought the way Ivan put it, he talked about disabling able people who could take part in discussions, was a pretty clear way of making that point. I think it is an issue for economic policymakers, and in particular for central banks. It's not unique to Ireland at all. and it is something that I'd like us to improve on. And there are people who write very complicated economics in very straightforward language. So this is something that is possible to do. And it's not simply about financial literacy. It's about being able to write well, which actually is a skill that isn't that not everyone has. But I just agree with that so much, and I very much. Those of you, if any of you ever read the blogs that I occasionally put on our website, I mean, one of the things I try and do, not necessarily succeed every time, is try and use de-jargonized language, to use Ivan's language. So just a few points which I wanted to comment on. I mean, I thought all the input has been incredibly helpful and insightful. Thank you very much to everyone for taking their time. As I said at the beginning in my opening remarks, thank you to those of you who have helped us put this together, in particular the wheel. Thank you to Ivan and Johnny for their support. Thank you to the community and voluntary and environmental pillars for encouraging their members to come. It really has been valuable for me, and I'm absolutely certain for my team. And you can be assured it'll be inputted into the ECB's review. I look forward to us talking again about where the review has got to. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Governor. Good afternoon, everybody.